All right, so we should be recording. All right, welcome everybody. We are here with Dr. Mike Van Amberg and the NDS team to give us a brief update. Actually, give us a brief description of the new update that we implemented on NDS as of last week, going from version 6.55 to 6.56. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, Mike.
All right, great. Thank you, Jacob. Hey, everybody. So this will be what I'll call a brief overview of the new structure of the model. I'll give you some of the reasons why, and then if you guys, and what you should expect to see. And then if you guys have any follow-up questions, there's some other guys that can help you out later. I'll be available myself. And I'll give credit to Andrew Lapierre here, who led the effort to build the submodel and restructure the thing over the last couple of years. It's been like everything we do with the CNCPS, it's an iterative process, and it's not something that happens overnight, especially when it comes to having the right data to test. All right, so I'm going to talk about isoacids, and I'll give you some context for that. All right, so I want to start with the current framework for predicting microbial nitrogen requirements in the CNCPS in 655, and then what that means for 656. All right, so many of you have likely seen this slide before. This is nothing new, right? But it does play into how we have to estimate the nitrogen requirements for the bacteria, right? So when we are feeding cows, the way the CNCPS is structured, all of these, especially the sugars, if you look at the non-fiber carbohydrates, the sugars, the fructans, and the starches are going to be consumed mostly by, protozoa and amylolytic type bacteria and some omnivores. And then you get into this B2 fraction. Let me get my pointer going here. This B2 fraction here, where we've got pectins, galactans, beta-galactans, and then there again, there's some omnivores that are consuming those. But in every case, the bacteria that digest these carbohydrates have particular nitrogen requirements, right? Every bacteria in the rumen can use ammonia, and I'll reinforce that here in a minute. But then others are specialized to, peptides, amino acids, and things like that. And then we come to the fiber carbohydrate digesting bacteria, right? We get into the structural carbohydrate, hemicellulose and cellulose. And, those again are a fibrolytic digesting bacteria. They're going to be a little bit slower. They have lower maintenance requirements. They attach, right? These guys over here, they swim around and they're more opportunistic. These guys on the structural carbohydrate side attach and can't move around as effectively when they're doing their job of digestion. So they have a slightly different physical requirement in terms of how we have to provide the nutrients and what level, because they might be stuck someplace where it's harder to get some of these things that we want them to have. They all use ammonia. These fiber carbohydrate bacteria cannot use peptides and amino acids, but they do have another requirement that we have rarely talked about, and that's what this new update's going to be about. And of course, then we have the C fraction, and it's not necessarily the lignin. I want to update this slide. I just haven't figured out how to do it. It's actually a graded response because the lignin is bound to some of the cellulose and the hemicellulose, and that creates what we really call UNDF, right? It's not as a simple demarcation here, but for the purposes today, we do have that fraction that's unavailable to any fermentation or degradation in the rumen. Right, so if we look at the current, and this is a really nice slide here. If you look at this current setup, this is 655. So I just talked about the rumen degradable carbohydrate pool. And we have to, for each one of those pools, whatever carbohydrate it is, we calculate the size of the pool based on the dry matter intake. And then we will analyze the rate of digestion and calculate the rate of passage to get the extent of digestion from that rate of digestion, we then calculate the bacterial growth requirements and supply, right? And that would include the maintenance, the growth, and then of course that's tied to the KD. Our assumption forever and always in the CNCPS is the rate of disappearance of the carbohydrate is collinear or equal to the rate of potential growth of the bacteria, right? So this YG is the maximum growth, the maintenance is the maintenance of the bacteria, but the rate of growth is tied to this KD, which is specific to the carbohydrate. And then when you integrate all this, that allows us to come up with the energy allowable bacteria, right? And this is the overarching calculation that says, hey, if you have 6,000 grams of fermentable carbohydrate in the rumen, you have the potential to, say, make 3,000 grams of bacteria. Let's just give it a 0.5 number. But once you do that, well, now you've got to calculate how much nitrogen does it take for those bacteria to both grow and ferment that carbohydrate. So now we shift over here, and again, we look at, now we have to ignore, we don't ignore the carbohydrates, but they're out of the picture for the moment, because now we have to say how much, dietary protein, degradable protein do we have, how much dietary ammonia, how much endogenous nitrogen are we recycling, whether that is urea and or just endogenous protein from the surface of the cells and things like that, from the mouth through the gastrointestinal tract. Then that gets us to this total rumen supply, this nitrogen supply, and then we say, okay, the bacteria have a certain nitrogen content, and that's going to dictate the demand, right, along with their maintenance requirement. And then allows us to calculate the nitrogen allowable bacteria. And then it's the balance between these two that are going to dictate how many bacteria we can grow in that rumen, which is why forever and always we've looked at the rumen ammonia balance, rumen nitrogen balance relative to the total carbohydrate. And we've always told everybody, hey, you want to be 120, maybe 130. And if you're at 180 or 200, that's the opportunity to figure out how to pull some of that protein out, some of that nitrogen out, and get it more in balance, and maybe bring in a little bit more carbohydrate actually. But it's going to be the balance of these two, right, or the most limiting of these two, that's going to dictate how much bacteria you're going to get, right? And as I said, the carbohydrate pools dictate the bacterial growth, right? It's the KD over KD plus KP. So that extent of digestion in the rumen is going to correlate very strongly with the rate of, or with the amount of bacteria we can get. And the passage rates, this KP, it's based on forage and concentrate, and the carbohydrate fraction is very sensitive to some other inputs unrelated to the feed. And those inputs include body weight and dry matter intake. So, my students in my class, the one thing they take out of my advanced nutrition class is weigh the cows, right? Hardest thing to do. It's the most important number we can get when we're formulating a diet. It's one of the most difficult numbers to get on a dairy farm. Maybe with all of this new technology, we'll figure out how to do that more conveniently. But right now, we don't do it very well. But having accurate body weights and knowing the dry matter intake are very important for getting this KP prediction. For the forages, we still are very explicit about this, even though we don't talk about a lot of the other equations. We are using the forage passage rate equation from the NOR4 system. And, we have arguments about this. Is this too slow? Is it not efficient enough? Should it vary more than it does if you actually paid attention to the rates? And what this passage rate equation, I think, is really doing is telling us what the rate of digestion, or what the rate of passage is of the more indigestible material. Because digestibility, the hard part with all passage rate equations, is none of them incorporate digestibility. But digestibility is the factor that's going to dictate the residency time. Because the more digestible the more gas production, the change in specific gravity, and that's what's going to hold the feed in the mat until that particle feed, until it digests, and then it's going to fall down to the bottom and then pass out, right? And we don't want to get into a lot of passage rate stuff here, but we do this. All these things are really important, because if we don't get some of these inputs right and we misappropriate the passage rate, now we haven't calculated the extent of digestion correctly, and we won't be able to estimate the microbial yield correctly, right? So it's all integrated, right? And then the bacterial growth coefficients this is the calculation. This goes back to really Russell back in '92. We haven't really changed it. We have modified some of it, especially as we get to version 7, it's going to be changed. The absolute calculation won't be changed, but how the coefficients work will be changed a little bit, because we've added some things into that model, like protozoa, that allow us to open up this YG, right? So, the growth coefficients are 1 over the maintenance divided by the rate of digestion of the fraction plus 1 over the maximum growth rate, right? And this is applied to all the carbohydrates. And this is applied to each carbohydrate fraction within each feed ingredient. And that calculates the bacterial growth coefficient. And again, is truly affected by the passage rate. So, but this is the basic structure of how we do all of this right now. And then once we have calculated all the carbohydrate fractions, right, we get the Rumen degradable carbohydrate pool. We multiply that by the bacterial growth coefficient, and we get the energy allowable bacteria. So again, this is the bacteria that's the number of bacteria, the amount of bacteria can be supported by the fermentation of those carbohydrates. And we always calculate that first. And then from that potential, we then back calculate how much nitrogen is going to be required to do that and meet that microbial growth or that bacterial growth. And then as you look at how we partition that, right, and the way we've done it, again, this is still 655. As I said earlier, the bacteria are specialized, right? So every bacteria in the rumen, for the most part, there's some obligate amino acid fermenters, but they're not in as high a quantity as we probably once thought they were. Jim Russell had identified some cows many years ago where he found large populations of these amino acid fermenting bacteria. But when we went out into dairy herds in upstate New York, we couldn't find those concentrations in all the cows we were looking at. So I probably got some cows that were selected in a strange way or fed in a way where those bacteria just proliferated. So, but when we look at the rest of the system here, we've got our amino acid nitrogen, and we have our ammonia nitrogen, right? And the amino acid nitrogen is coming from the diet, the ammonia nitrogen is coming from the diet and the animal, back to peptides, back to endogenous things like that. The NFC bacteria, the amylolytic bacteria, take up amino acid nitrogen for their requirement. The way they operate, and this is their niche, they can move much faster than the fibrolytic bacteria. And in the presence of a lot of sugar or a lot of starch, they're going to work hard to outcompete those fiber bugs for resources. And one of their tricks is they've evolved the ability to use amino acid nitrogen. And in fact, if you think about how they partition, 2/3 of their nitrogen requirement can come from peptides and amino acids. And this is a real efficiency for them, because now they don't have to take up an ammonia, build the amino acid, and incorporate it. They can just grab the amino acid, stick it in place, build their cell wall, build their enzymes, and go. So that allows them to move much faster. That's also why they have a higher maintenance requirement, because of that metabolic rate. but they have the ability to do that, right? But they still are going to require some ammonia. Whereas the fiber bacteria, the way we've managed them for all these years is they use nothing but ammonia for their requirement. And we considered that as long as we understand the ammonia balance, that's going to meet the requirements of those fibrolytic bacteria. And that's where that's where the change is coming in the Rumen submodel. Right. So again, if we just do this in a kind of an accounting fashion, so here's a diet. We've got in this case 27 kilos of dry matter intake. Here's the amount of the forages and the other ingredients. We can calculate the energy allowable bacteria for each of these carbohydrate pools here, and you can see that if you add that all up, we get about just over 4,200 grams of bacteria, energy allowable bacteria from this diet, right? And we get our ratios, and then now we have to calculate the nitrogen available for those bacteria. And I won't go through this in detail, but you can see down here, the total ends up being about almost 5,400 grams of nitrogen. So when you look at that, you say, well, we're in great shape, right? We've got 4,200 grams of energy allowable bacteria. We have almost 5,400 grams of nitrogen allowable bacteria. This should be a really good diet, and we should be able to move forward and not have any deficiencies, right? So I didn't do the math on this, but I'm going to say, hey, we're 125 to 130% of our rumen ammonia balance because it's in excess of that energy allowable bacteria. And that's how we've calculated this forever. Right, back to what's first limiting. Yeah, but and I've wanted to do this. Quite frankly, I've been wanting to have a branch chain VFA submodel since the mid 2000s. I was thinking about this back in 2007, 2008, 2009. Couldn't get it done, so I'm glad we finally got there. Why is this important? And there's, again, this could be its own talk. But where do these things come into play? Why am I bringing up branch chain VFAs? Well, what we learned in 1960, so we've known about this requirement since 1960, and it evolved over time. Marv Bryant, Robinson, and many others elucidated these requirements, and it's been worked on for years. And then Jeff Firkins picked up on some of this over time. And what we know is that these fibrolytic bacteria cannot take up amino acids, and they can't efficiently make branched chain amino acids. So they have an obligate requirement for the branched chain volatile fatty acids, which are really the keto acids of the branched chain amino acids. And those branched chain VFAs are for branched chain amino acid synthesis and requirements in the pathways in the fibrolytic bacteria, right? We know the fibrolytic bacteria rely on ammonia, but they need these branched chain VFAs so they can fill some pathways, increase membrane fluidity and invoke bacterial growth, right? So they're primarily met through the decarboxylation of the dietary branched chain amino acids and fermentation of carbohydrates from the amylolytic bacteria. And I think this is where this gets to be a really diabolical process, because the amylolytic bacteria are the ones that are going to take the branched chain amino acids, decarboxylate, actually take the just decarboxylation. They're going to take the amine group off, and they're going to add a carbonyl group, and then that creates the VFA, and then and then the fibrolytic bacteria can take them up. And we have lots of data that says, hey, if there's a deficiency and we add the branched chain VFAs, we see improvements in bacterial growth, we see improvements in microbial yield, we see improvements in milk flow and components, right? And I'm not going to get into all that here. I just want to give you guys the big overview of where this is going. So essentially what we've done with 656 is we've built in the requirements for these branch chain VFAs to better define and meet the requirements for the fibrolytic digesting bacteria, right? And I'm very happy for this because I think there's been many occasions where we see cows not behaving correctly and we cannot figure out why. And I think this has been one of the primary reasons, especially with higher starch diets and digestible forage, and we see cows not doing what we think they should do. I think it's because the fibrolytic bacteria just didn't have enough of their essential nutrients. So if you look at leucine, isoleucine, and valine, in this case, what's going to happen is these amine groups here are going to be removed. And in place of these amine groups, they're going to stick an oxygen on there, carbonyl group, and that then becomes the iso acid. You know, we change their names, you know, isovalerate, isobutyrate, 2-methylbutyrate. You know, that is when those branch chain VFAs are now able to be taken up by the bacteria, the fibrolytic bacteria. The difficult part is the amylolytic bacteria can make them, but if they see an opportunity because they've got lots of starch, they can also take them back up. So there's a lot of cycling, right? But we're going to talk about what this means, right? So now what's going to happen is we're going to incorporate all of this now, not just ammonia, right? We've got ammonia here running on one side as we did before. So on the right side of the slide here, we've got all the same calculations that I showed you before for Rumen nitrogen balance, which is the way the models run ever since its inception. What we've done now is we've added another level of requirement specifically for the fiber digesting bacteria, where we look at bacterial turnover, right? Because bacteria are going to die, protozoa are going to die. They're going to purge themselves. That's going to provide some nitrogen. We're going to look at peptide balances because we have to look at the soluble true protein requirement, basically the A2 pool. And then we're going to have exogenous supplementation, and all together, that's going to give us, you know, a branch chain VFA supply. Really, what this initially does is give us a branch chain amino acid supply, which then is going to tell us how much can be converted to a branch chain VFA, and that's going to give us the branch chain VFA allowable bacteria. And then together, these two are going to impact how the energy allowable bacteria are calculated, right? Which one of these are first limiting? Because again, up until this time, we put all of this requirement onto the nitrogen allowable bacteria, and that hasn't been entirely accurate because we've misrepresented or just didn't represent these obligate requirements for these fiber bugs with the branch chain VFAs, right? So now when we look at this, right, so we've got back to our the diet that I showed you, we've back to our 4,200 grams of energy allowable bacteria, not quite 5,400 grams of nitrogen allowable bacteria. But now we're going to go through the process of saying, okay, we're going to come over here now. We did the nitrogen side. Now we're going to come over and estimate, do we have enough branch chain VFAs to ferment the carbohydrate B3 carbohydrates, the NDF, essentially. And if energy allowable is greater than branch chain allowable, then we're going to reduce the bacterial growth to the level that the branch chain VFAs will support, and that's going to reduce fiber degradation, okay? So what 656 is going to do is you might see a Rumen nitrogen balance of 130% or 150%. And you'll say, hey, I'm great. But what's going to happen now is you're going to have another limitation because we've got another opportunity to meet a requirement. And maybe the branch chain VFAs are going to be first limiting. And that's what's going to dictate how much bacterial flow you're going to get. right? So what does this look like, right? Well, here's a diet. Again, we don't need to spend time on this, but this is similar to many diets that we'd see: heavy corn silage, grass silage, some corn grain, soybean meal, soy hulls, some citrus pulp, a little canola, some heat treated soy, a little fat, maybe a touch of blood, some urea, right? And then some protected methionine. And if you look at the dietary composition, it's about 16% crude protein, RDP at about 10.5, true RDP. And I think you're going to start to see this true RDP, which would be the true protein, the amino acid protein, the peptide protein, is 9.7. And we're breaking that out because the RDP can include the ammonia pool. And in this case, in trying to define these requirements, we need to be much more specific about what we have in that soluble pool or available pool in the rumen that's really amino acid protein in that RDP. Right. So got cows making 97 pounds of 4.2 milk and 3.2 true protein. So pretty standard cows, not anything unusual. So if we look at the branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, and valine, and we break out the branched chain VFAs that they convert to, so isovalerate, 2-methylbutyrate, and isobutyrate, and you look at their requirements and the rumen available supply, and then the rumen balance. Now we get to the rumen balance, branched chain amino acid to isoacid supply. We see that in this case, isovalerate looks okay, but 2-methylbutyrate and isobutyrate do not, right? We've got some subtle deficiencies. So here's our branched chain allowable fiber carbohydrate bacteria. The branched chain allowable bacteria end up at 4430. But we have an energy allowable bacteria of 4589. We have a nitrogen allowable bacteria of 5,400 grams. But our most limiting nutrient here for microbial growth, especially for the fiber digesting bacteria, is going to be the branched chain amino acid allowable bacteria. So that's got us at 4430. So we're about 150 grams deficient on branched chain amino acids, branched chain VFAs, to meet the requirements for those fibrolytic bacteria. So what we would see here is we want to be making 97 pounds of milk, but because of that limitation, our ME and MP allowable milk are running about 93. So we're about 5 pounds short of meeting that requirement, simply because we don't have enough of the branched chain amino acids, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to supplement some branched chain VFAs. We're going to overcome this limitation. Now our branched chain amino acid allowable bacteria are up to 4660. All right, this is what the submodel is going to allow you to do, is figure out how do you supplement this, right? Can you use enough soybean meal to do this? And the answer is you can, but you're going to find out you're adding a lot of soybean meal to get these soluble true protein numbers up where you can overcome this process, right? But now all of a sudden we took the limitation off, and we have plenty of nitrogen allowable bacteria. Now we have plenty of branched chain allowable bacteria. Now we can meet our requirements, and our ME and our MP milk are now matching what we want our inputted milk to be, or what we think we should be observing. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is the update, right? It's going to allow us to break out the requirements for the fibrolytic bacteria, for the branched chain amino acid and branched chain VFAs. This sounds like a real refinement at some level, and minutia maybe to some people, but I can tell you from my own experience in dealing with high canola diets, blood meal, and a little bit of protected soy, that in upstate New York, we've run into these deficiencies here in Cayuga County in central New York over the last few years. So I'm happy to have this update. All right. So when are you going to likely see a deficiency? High rumen fermentable carbohydrate load, diets greater than 14% dry matter fermentable MDF can have appreciable branched chain VFA requirements. Branched chain VFA requirements. I'll get this out. So you know, we're going to start looking. The way I would hope you do this is you start looking at these numbers a little bit differently. I know this sounds kind of funny, but sometimes we get caught up in certain numbers that we feel comfortable with, but don't look at some other things that we haven't traditionally used. So I think there's going to be some education here, and we're going to have to help inform ourselves, me included, about how do we really approach this. And that's why we're giving you these numbers, right? Diets greater than 40% of dry matter from total fermentable carbohydrates can limit isoacid supply, right? And that's just less branch chain VFA cross-feeding the fiber bacteria from NFC bacteria. Again, if you get high starch, high sugar, and those fiber or those amylolytic bacteria have an opportunity to digest more of that carbohydrate, they may make the branch chain VFAs, but they're going to cycle them back up because it's more efficient for them just to use them straight away, right? And that's one of their niches. So we need to look at the appropriate protein profiles, protein A2, B1, and B2 to the fermentable carbohydrate profiles. And again, I mentioned the true RDP is really important there. We want that right now, the way we have it structured, we want that to be greater than 9% of the dry matter. You can't throw more ammonia or urea at this and overcome this process because that's just ignoring these requirements. Rumen ammonia, again, we're at least 125, maybe 130%. We haven't really changed a lot on that. And then we're going to have to reconcile the branch chain amino acid branch chain VFA balances by evaluating the degradable amino acids in the rumen, right? And your ratio of true RDP to kilograms of fermentable carbohydrate, 185 to 215, or true RDP and to fermentable carbohydrate, 84 to 98, right? So again, we'll start looking at some of these ratios to help provide some guidance on when you should see deficiencies and where you should be to overcome the deficiency. And be happy to take any questions. I know we won't do that today because this is a recording, but Andrew Lapierre and Jeff Tchaikovsky are listed down here. You can come back to me or you can go to those guys and we'll help answer your questions if you get stuck.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike, for that brief introduction.
Probably wasn't as brief as you probably wanted, but that's okay.
Well,
What's that?
I said, well, it's still, it was brief compared to a lot of things. So.
Oh man, it was full.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
awesome.
I know. It's just the way my brain works, guys. I don't know what's going to come out of my mouth when I start. That's one of my problems when I start talking anymore.